Hey there and welcome back to another Disney video. And today I want to talk about a little film called The Emperor's New Groove. And I'm not here to make some grand theory interweaving different films to create some crazy shared universe. And this isn't a video talking about how underrated this film is and that it deserves better in terms of its success and recognition. It isn't even a video talking about how it should get a proper sequel. Because let's try to forget Kronk's New Groove, alright? Honestly, this video is really just going to be me gushing about how good this movie is and talking about how it went from a box office and critical disappointment to being one of Disney's ultimate cult classics and found a huge audience and appreciative fan base many years after it first released in cinemas. Released in 2000, The Emperor's New Groove tells the story of Cusco, the emperor of the Inca Empire, who's betrayed by his advisor Yzma and transformed by a magic potion into a llama and left to die. Through sheer luck, he finds himself in the village inhabited by Pacha, a village that he'd planned on demolishing in order to build his new summer pleasure palace. So, obviously Pacha's not exactly sympathetic to Cusco's plight. And yet, despite all of that, he decides to take him on and try to help him. And it's at this point that Yzma realizes that her minion, Kronk, didn't end up killing Cusco like he said he would, and thus she goes after him, Kronk in tow, to finish the job. After a series of near misses and a big old game of cat and mouse resulting in a final confrontation in Cusco's palace between the heroes and the villains, Cusco returns to human form and Yzma gets turned into a cat. Yeah, the plot sounds cheesy and silly and honestly kinda dumb, and it is. But it works, because this story is heartfelt. And the scripts are really funny. It takes you on an interesting adventure, and no matter whether you're following the hero storyline or the villain storyline, the movie never feels slow or plotting or dull. It's engaging the entire way through and is well paced. There isn't really a wasteful scene that drags too long or feels utterly superfluous to the story, because even the filler feels engaging. But beyond just the story itself, there's still so much to enjoy about the film. One of the biggest elements, of course, being its characters and character development. And we'll start off with Cusco, the Emperor, who's probably the best example of character development throughout the film. When we first meet him, he's just the worst. Entitled and whiny. He cares only about himself and what he wants. Despite having an already enormous palace, he decides he wants to build himself a summer home and will destroy the village of some kindly peasants in order to get what he wants, not really caring that this would in turn destroy their lives. But after he's turned into a llama and left for dead, he's humbled. He no longer has that selfish drive. He learns what it means to have nothing and to live at the whims of other people, and he bonds with the peasants that make up his empire. He sees their lives and he realizes that in a lot of ways, they're more fulfilled than he is. And so after he retakes his throne, while he still has the same personality underneath it all, at the same time, he no longer wants the same things that he wanted at the start of the film. He no longer behaves the same way that he did before. His whole axis tilts, and it's quite a rewarding cinematic experience watching his perspective shift gradually over the course of the movie. And yeah, Pacha, Yzma, a good secondary protagonist and a really good villain. But the best of the secondary characters has got to be Kronk, Yzma's henchman and sidekick. And I really don't think I can describe just how funny this character is. He probably has the best lines in the entire movie and is a great interpretation of the gentle giant trope. He doesn't really have an arc per se, as he's always the kindly, simple, gentle giant, but his storyline basically involves him trying to justify being a villain to himself despite being an all-around sweetheart who loves baking and is a member of the Boy Scouts, or was it Squirrel Scouts? I can't quite recall. Regardless, as a kid, I remember thinking that he was the best part of the film. And really, it is hard to get sick of him. Just don't watch his spin-off sequel movie, because that's a clear case of too much of a good thing. But anyway, what more could you really ask from a Disney film? It has a great story, a great cast of characters, and whilst it's clearly geared to be a comedy, it also has a few good moments of pathos that round out the emotional experience. So imagine my surprise when I learned that this film only really became beloved years after it first debuted. That it was the next generation that really picked up the torch for this film. Because when the film was released, turns out it really wasn't much of a critical or commercial success. And we'll start off by looking at the box office. It grossed $169 million off a budget of $100 million, and that is not a good showing for a Disney film. Hell, it only just beat out Anastasia in total gross. And that film was the first attempt by a brand new Fox animated studio, so it was both new and being made by a relative no-name studio. This was made by Disney, and a Disney still riding the wave of the Renaissance. And honestly, whilst the gross was more than Anastasia, Anastasia actually made a profit on their film, and whilst this one says it made a profit, with advertising costs, I doubt it. This one seems like it was a massive fail for the House of Mouse. And in fact, it was the lowest gross for Disney since the dark days of the mid-80s. But beyond that, its critical performance also left a lot to be desired. Because whilst now it sits pretty happily on an 86% on Rotten Tomatoes, this was not always the case. In fact, when it first released, it really wasn't thought of all that well at all. And I think there really are a couple of major reasons for this, but I think the most prominent is the fact that it was so different to what Disney had been making up to this point in time. It wasn't a grand epic journey starring a glorious hero like Hercules or Tarzan or Mulan, and it wasn't a heartfelt Broadway-style musical with singing and dancing and all that like Beauty and the Beast. It was a relatively goofy comedy film. And whilst it's not like Disney was new to that style of film, it was definitely a huge deviation and tonal shift to what people were expecting based on what they were making at the time. And it's almost like it came out too soon, because we hadn't yet seen the release of films like Ice Age and Shrek that did similar things. Films that de-emphasized musical numbers after more than a decade of that being the popular style, and made slapstick comedy and parody really come to the forefront of animated entertainment. And I feel like it's a lot like The Road to El Dorado in that respect. A film that wasn't quite what people were expecting, and yet was an early pioneer of the next era of animated films. It wasn't all that well received early on, but after its release on DVD and VHS, it started to gather a bit of a following and became one of Disney's more popular home video releases, generating another $125 million in revenue over the next few years. And then, as the internet came to the forefront, these kids whose parents bought them the DVD or video were able to unite, and people were able to retroactively look back at the film and realize that perhaps the initial reception of the film was way too harsh, and that perhaps they were being a bit blinded by their ongoing nostalgia for the Disney of the 90s and were unwilling to let go of that expectations and move into a new era. And I don't think it helped that at the time the film was also being planned to be an epic musical titled The Kingdom of the Sun, which was going to be the Disney retelling of The Prince and the Pauper. But then they decided to go in a new direction due to the poor performances of Pocahontas and Hunchback of Notre Dame, and gradually it became the film we know today. And I think the funniest part of all the hate that it received for being too different is that if it remained the epic musical it was intended to be, whilst it probably would have been more liked at the time, I think there was a good chance it would have ended up being forgotten in the way that Hunchback and Pocahontas have been forgotten for the most part. But by making it different, whilst it got shat on at the time, it's now crafted an enduring legacy as a cult classic, and will forever, and I mean forever, top people's lists of the most underrated or underappreciated Disney films. But anyway, with all that being said, these were just my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What do you think of The Emperor's New Groove? Like it? Hate it? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.